fixed weight price indices and time-dependent pricing models, and wage expectations and job search. As always, a special thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schunle at Brandeis and Dominic Smith at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This webinar will be 45 minutes and contain 2 presentations, which will be 15 minutes each, followed by 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio or video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, post their questions during the presentations already and do not have to wait until the end. I will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar after the presentations are done. This webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel, and it will be recorded and made available on the CEBRA website, www.cebra.org, and the CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. Finally, a disclaimer. Participation in a CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA-co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. Okay, so our first presentation for today is by Professor Martin Eichenbaum, and it is substitution bias and fixed weight price indices in time-dependent pricing models. Marty?
Great. Can you guys see my screen, I hope?
Yes, we can.
Fabulous. I'm just going to go to the, sorry. Okay, here. Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to see everyone. I'm going to talk about a somewhat technical topic, and that's substitution bias and fixed price indices in the kinds of models that many central bankers use at various points, namely time-dependent pricing models. And the work is joint with Larry Cristiano and Ben Johansen at the Board of Governors, and none of this reflects the views of anyone at the board. Okay, so let me start with an introduction, which is a true price index fully reflects consumers' substitution across goods as relative price changes. Fixed weight prices, like Laspierre's index, don't. Now, researchers, including myself, often compare model-based inflation in the true price index, say coming out of a model, with data-based inflation measures that are constructed from fixed weight indices like the CPI. And I'm going to talk about a little theorem, not in great detail, but under mild assumptions, the inflation as measured by the true price index and the fixed weight index can be unbounded. And the theorem it requires mild assumptions, but they're satisfied by almost all the kind of models that we typically play with. So the quantitative question is, when does the mismatch in inflation measures lead to misleading inference? Okay. Why is this happening? Oh, I see. Okay. And then I'm going to look at a little case study. We'll look at a little NK model. And we're going to see that the difference between these fixed weight and true price indices are going to be increasing in price stickiness, the elasticity of substitution across goods, and the level of inflation. Then I'm going to look at the issue of how different these indices were during the past 5 years when the US inflation rose rapidly and then declined. And we'll see that those differences can be large and persistent, but the differences were small in the decade before when when inflation was low and stable. Okay. All right, so what's a true price index? Well, let's think about the value of a bundle required to produce 1 unit of consumption. So imagine there's a bunch of goods, XIT, each have a price PIT, and you want to find how much does that bundle cost. So let's talk about the solution to that problem. Well, this C function is going to be homothetic, monotonic, etc. I'm going to make the first assumption, or I guess the second assumption, that for all t and I, this choice of X star IT and PIT are positive and finite. Now, a technical assumption is called inessentiality, and it basically means that you can always choose not to consume some goods and still put together a bundle and get positive utility. So that's used in some of the proofs. And again, as I say, it's going to be satisfied by the NK model. Okay, so an arithmetic price index is just going to be, notice this omega I over here. We're going to look at the integral of prices weighted by some fixed weights. And those weights are typically going to be some optimal choice of things that you did in the past, or some unconditional average. Now, with a little bit of algebra, you can characterize the difference between the true price index and this fixed price index in this way. So there's some relative price of good I, and then there's the difference between what you would choose if you could choose freely versus the weight that that good gets in the price index. Um, so, at a qualitative level, the difference between pi t and pi ft, that's going to depend a lot on the extent of price dispersion across goods caused by recent price changes and consumers' willingness to substitute between goods. So the first proposition, which I won't prove, is that the rate of inflation in the true price index, there's a typo here, is bounded, and the fixed price index can, in principle, be arbitrarily higher than the true price index. In practice, the exact relationship in real time between these two rates of inflation is a quantitative issue that I will come back to. Now, Proposition 1 doesn't rely on it being a Calvo model per se, Taylor model, in which a deterministic subset of firms change their prices in each period, everything will go through. And, we also do this for geometric mean, fixed weight price indices. And again, you get basically you do get a version of Proposition 1 for that geometric mean weight. Okay, so let's look at the NK model. And, we're all familiar with this. But, if you have a CES consumption aggregator over the individual goods, um, the uh, the the cost to produce, up to some scalar 1 unit of the consumption good optimally, depends on these epsilons in a formula we're all familiar with. These XITs are differentiated goods produced by the monopolist, and one, two, and three hold. So when we teach these courses, we all show the students that PT is given by this, average, geometric average, I guess, of the underlying goods, again, where epsilon is governing that substitutability. Now, so what's the standard Calvo assumption? Well, there's some measure theta of randomly selected monopolists, and they can't re-optimize their prices, and they're just going to set their price will be whatever it was in the previous period. Now, this was a surprise to me, and I must say, Ben Johansson, I'm not sure we're the very first ones to say this, but it's certainly true. There's an upper bound on inflation in the NK model. You can, never mind the Lucas critique, you can't get typically very high rates of inflation in the true price index. And what's driving that, again, is consumers can substitute from goods produced by firms that don't reoptimize their prices, and that gives the bound on inflation in the NK model. You can see that larger values of epsilon, so things are more substitutable, you get a smaller bound in the true price index. And it's also true that the bound depends on theta, which governs how many monopolists can't reoptimize their prices. So the higher theta is, the smaller is the bound. Why is that? Well, theta gets up, there's a larger subset of firms that can't reoptimize their prices. So uh, consumers can substitute to the goods of a large subset of firms whose price hasn't been reoptimized, and so that's going to make the upper bound of inflation in the NK model smaller. Again, remember the common reset price in a NK model. I'm going to call it P twiddle T. Um, as that reset price gets really big, inflation in the NK model is going to hit the upper bound. And the relationship between P hat T over PT it can become unboundedly large because PT is bounded. And pi ft can become much larger. And the intuition again is that as consumers can substitute to the goods that haven't reoptimized their prices, and that substitution effect isn't reflected in the fixed weight price-based inflation. Um, the CPI is constructed using arithmetic and geometric mean prices. So we also look at the relationship between this type of a price index, inflation, it's geometric, and the true price index, and it's very similar to the relationship between pi ft and pi t. Okay, you can also look at a Laspierre price index, which basically uses weights from yesterday all the time, right? And in general, the difference between pi and pi L is increasing in the steady state inflation rate. But what it doesn't do is capture substitution it does capture substitution up to period t minus one, but it doesn't capture substitution in period t. Okay, so in the real world, the CPI is typically constructed in two stages. First, prices within most categories are combined using a geometric average, and the weights in that geometric average come from expenditures in previous periods. Second, the categories are combined across sectors using a modified Laspierre index. So it's an arithmetic fixed weight index where the weights come from the previous period expenditures across sectors. And more generally, if we think about it, we expect more substitutability within a sector than across sectors. Now, the standard NK model doesn't have a rich enough industry structure to mimic two-stage construction of the CPI, although a lot of the new network models that are being developed and are, quite exciting, you would be able to do that. But for the simple NK model, you can think of the different prices as coming either from monopolists within a sector or from monopolists across a sector, which is to say that the model's analog of the core CPI, you can think of as either this fixed weight price index or this geometric price index. And you would adopt different values of epsilon depending on the interpretation of what's going on in the NK model. You would want more or less substitution. Okay, I'm going to look at measured inflation, and we're not going to periodically update the weights of the indices in our calculations for two reasons. We're really interested in the rapid rise in inflation after 2020. And after that kind of a short period, the weights in the CPI wouldn't change much to reflect expenditure patterns across goods. But also more technically, you can see the paper, the results aren't very sensitive to choosing different starting dates, and that maps into certain relationship between the real price index and say the fixed weight price index. Okay. Now, if you do a lot of substitution, let's imagine the core inflation corresponds to pi ft. So it turns out you can derive, and this is in the paper, it's pretty straightforward, a relationship involving the fixed weight price index and the actual rate of inflation. And here's an expression for the difference between pi t minus pi ft. So notice that you can use these two equations to compute the value of pi t implied by the model. That is to say, if you have the CPI and a value for theta, you can play with these two equations and say, oh, if that's true and the model was true, what would pi t be? So I'm just going to go to this figure now. And the first figure, just shows us core CPI for 2011 to 2024. And panel B implements the equations I talked about before, and it shows the difference between pi t and the fixed weight price index for different values of epsilon, under the assumption that pi ft, the fixed weight price index, is the model analog to core CPI. We did it other ways, and you're not going to get much of a difference. Here we're assuming theta um, is the probability of being able to change your price index is about 0.75. So, what you see here is, when inflation was low and stable before COVID, this issue about which measure you're working with is not particularly important. But once you get to the COVID period, these are quite substantial differences. They can be 1 percentage point, which when it comes to inflation in central banker world, presumably is a really big deal. The bottom panel also redoes everything for epsilon equals 7, but here we're varying theta. And again, you can see for the different values of theta, you can get very large differences in the price in the rate of inflation. So you might say, well, okay, is this any different if you had done this with a Les Beers price index or pi GT, which was a geometric average? And again, none of the conclusions about the standard NK model depend on whether we think of the CPI as arithmetic or a geometric mean fixed weight price. So let me add up to conclude. In the NK model in the post 2020 period, inflation in model-based fixed weight price industries differ markedly from model-based measures of inflation in the true price index. Those differences are increasing in price stickiness and the degree to which consumers are willing to substitute across data. So there's two issues here. One is if you're a researcher and you want to say, how well is my model doing at inflation? If you're in a high inflation period, you want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And we typically do not. And I say I've committed that sin. And just generally, if you're a central banker, you want to be alert to the substitution bias, because when looking how well are we doing on the inflation target, et cetera, that accurate measurement of taking into account the substitution bias can be very substantial. So I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you. Um, Next, we have Johannes Wolfart presenting wage expectations and job search.
Okay, so my slides are there, right? Okay, good. All right, yeah, thanks very much for including our paper in this nice seminar series. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm presenting a paper today that's called Wage Expectations and Job Search. And this is joint work with Steffen Altmann, Robert Mahlstedt, Malte Rattenborg, Alexander Sebald, and Sonja Settele. So the starting point of this paper is really that expectations are central in theories of job search, and traditional models of job search typically model expectations as being formed rationally and under full information. However, we by now have growing evidence that there are important information frictions and also misperceptions in a job search context. What we ask in this paper is to, how do these misperceptions and subjective beliefs more generally shape job search behavior and labor market outcomes empirically? And we tackle this question for beliefs about available wage offers. So basically, for unemployed job seekers, beliefs about the wages that they can earn when they find a new job. Now, answering these questions poses several challenges. So first of all, belief measures are often unavailable for large samples of the relevant population, say for unemployed job seekers. Second, correlational evidence on the relationship between subjective beliefs and decisions can be confounded by omitted variables, reverse causality, or measurement error in subjective beliefs. And then finally, measures of search behavior that we have is typically self-reported in surveys and therefore potentially subject to noise, reporting biases, or also intention action gaps. And perhaps because of these challenges, we by now only have limited causal evidence on the role of subjective expectations in job search. So in this paper, we address these challenges and circumvent these challenges through what we think is a unique combination of different aspects. So what we do is we invite all Danish unemployment insurance recipients to our survey via the official digital government mailing system, which gives us a sample of about 9,000 unemployed job seekers. In our survey, we generate exogenous variation in people's expected wage offers for themselves by providing them with wage projections based on the reemployment wages of comparable workers in the past. And then we link our survey data with administrative outcome data on search behavior from a job search platform and labor market outcomes from the Danish population registers. And with this setup, we are able to provide causal evidence on the role of wage expectations in shaping job search and labor market outcomes. Other people have worked on this, so we're building on the previous literature here. I'll skip the details here in the interest of time, and instead directly move on to the design of our survey. So the idea in our survey is that we want to generate exogenous variation in people's expectations about their next wage offer by correcting their misperceptions about comparable workers' reemployment wages. Okay. And to do this in our survey, we start in the beginning, with eliciting several background characteristics of our respondents, like age, gender, unemployment duration, and so on. Then we measure our respondents' prior beliefs about reemployment wages of comparable workers in the past. This is basically just to get an idea of what people actually think before we provide them with information. After that, a random half of our respondents is assigned to an information treatment where they receive the actual average reemployment wages of comparable workers in the past, while a control group receives no information. Subsequently, we measure people's beliefs about their own next wage offers and elicit several survey-based job search outcomes, such as people's reservation wages or their willingness to make concessions in order to secure reemployment. Okay, so how do these wage projections look like? We had two goals in mind. So the information that we provide our respondents with should be, on the one hand, relevant. So it should be a relevant signal about their earnings potential, and it should also be truthful. So this is in order to not deceive respondents and to for ethical reasons. How do we define comparable job seekers? We would define them along 7 characteristics. So we have 2 categories of gender, 3 categories of education, then we have age, the current point in the unemployment spell, whether someone was previously full-time or part-time employed, someone's industry in the previous job, and someone's wage in the previous job. This gives us a total of more than 7,000 cells in the population, and within each cell, we basically go to the Danish population registers and look at job seekers, unemployed job seekers over the last 10 years and calculate their average reemployment wages, conditional on these characteristics. What we also did is just to make sure that this is really relevant, we looked at the control group of our experiment, which is not treated, and we look at the reemployment wages of control group workers after our experiment. And within that group, this wage projection here is actually strongly predictive of the actual reemployment wages, which suggests that we provide them with relevant information. Okay, so here you see an example treatment screen that a respondent in the treatment group sees. So here we tell our respondents, this is after eliciting their prior beliefs. You said you think that the average monthly salary of a person similar to you when starting the new full-time job was 30,000 krona. We would now like to give you information on the actual average salary of individuals who, at the time when they took up a new full-time job, had been unemployed for the same time as you have now, had the same level of education as you, had the same age as you have now, and so on. And then we tell them the average wage is, in this case, 33,000 Danish krona. Our respondents also see this dynamic figure, which on the left-hand side shows a bar as their wage in their previous job. In yellow, we display to them their prior belief about the reemployment wages of comparable workers. And in blue, we actually show them the actual average reemployment wage of comparable workers. So this respondent here slightly underestimated reemployment wages of comparable workers and receives a positive update about the earnings potential of workers like them. Okay, just a few details on the procedures. Our contact group was the stock of unemployment benefit recipients in the entire country in Denmark as of November 2023. So these were about 80,000 individuals. We contacted them via the mailing system of the Danish public authorities. We sent out personalized invitation and also incentivized survey participation. And this gave us a final sample of about 9,000 respondents, which is actually quite a high response rate for service of this type. We conducted a follow-up survey about 1 week later, where we were able to recontact about 40% of these initial respondents. And then importantly, we linked the survey data to click level data on job search from the official online platform of the Danish Public Employment Service, jobnet.dk. Unemployment benefit recipients, they're actually required to log in a certain number of times per week on this platform. A lot of the, I think most of the jobs that actually unemployment job seekers secure in Denmark are actually posted on this platform. A lot of the matching occurs through this platform, and we can follow people's clicks, can construct a measure of search intensity and also the direction of search. We also link our survey data to administrative register data on actual employment and earnings up to 6 months after our survey. Okay, so in the paper we have a job search model that we use to just derive some predictions. I'll just briefly summarize the key predictions of this model here. So in the model, there are subjective beliefs about wage. So we have a model with unemployed job seekers, which holds subjective beliefs about wage offers. Jobs are valued for wages, but also for non-wage characteristics such as working conditions. Job search effort actually increases the chances of receiving an offer, but is also costly. And this model makes several predictions for how an increase in wage expectations should affect search behavior. So under quite mild conditions, an increase in my expectations about available wage offers should actually increase my reservation wage. It should also increase my threshold for acceptable non-wage attributes unless workers perceive compensating differentials. So here there is an ambiguous prediction about how people adjust their targeted non-wage attributes of the next job. And then there are also opposing predictions for search intensities. On the one hand, higher returns to securing reemployment in the form of a higher wage should actually increase search effort through a kind of a substitution effect. But then on the other hand, if search improves job quality, then higher expected wages might actually also reduce my need to search hard, which could also reduce search effort, which is kind of an income effect. And so here, effects on search effort are also an empirical question that we can look at in our experiment. Okay, so let me jump into the results, starting with prior beliefs. So what I plot here is the difference between people's subjective beliefs about reemployment wages of workers with similar characteristics as them, and the objective benchmark, so actual reemployment wages of workers similar to them. So this is not about people's beliefs about their own next wage offer. This is about their beliefs about reemployment wages of comparable workers. And what you can see here is that on average, our respondents are actually fairly well calibrated. So the average respondent overestimates reemployment wages of comparable workers by only about 2%. But there's strong heterogeneity. So about a quarter of the sample have a strong optimism bias exceeding, where their beliefs actually exceed the objective benchmark by 15% or more. And then about 20% have a similarly sized negative bias. And what our experiment essentially does is it corrects these misperceptions of people's beliefs about reemployment wages of comparable workers by basically, shifting everyone towards the truth into the middle of this distribution, and thereby generates exogenous variation in people's expectations about their own next wage offer. So that's our goal with the experiment. We can test this, and then we can use this exogenous variation to study the causal effect of wage expectations on job search decisions. All right, so let's look at effects on people's beliefs and labor market behavior. So in our experiment, just one slide on the empirical strategy, the first stage effects of our intervention on people's expectations about their own next wage offers should actually vary with their prior misperceptions about comparable workers' wages. And to actually account for this, we need to estimate treatment effects separately for different groups. So we defined the perception gap as the difference between actual re-employment wages of comparable workers and people's prior, our respondents' prior belief about it. And then we estimate treatment effects separately for 5 different groups. So we have one group with large negative perception gaps. So these are people who overestimate re-employment wages of comparable workers by 15% or more. Among this group, the treated respondents, they receive a large negative shock. Then we have one group with moderate perception gaps between -2.5 and 15%. We have a neutral group and so on. And within each group, so basically, we have 5 groups with comparable prior misperceptions. And within each group, we can compare posterior outcomes between treated and control respondents. Okay. So this gives us an idea about the causal effect of getting a large negative shock, a moderate negative shock, and so on. Okay, so on this slide, I show you treatment effects for our first stage outcome for people's beliefs about their own next wage offer. On the left-hand side, these are treatment effects for people with a prior perception gap of -15% or more. So these are people who overestimate other, comparable workers' re-employment wages by 15% or more. And within this group, receiving our information, being debiased in a sense, reduces people's expectations about their own next wage offer by about 4%. So by contrast, if we look at the group here on the right-hand side, these are people with a prior perception gap of 15% or more. Among this group, receiving our treatment actually increases their beliefs about their next own wage offer by about 5%. Okay. So we see that, and we have, similar but smaller changes in own wage expectations for those with more moderate misperceptions. We don't have any effect for those with no misperceptions to begin with, as we would expect. So what this slide tells us is that our intervention is successful or appears successful in shifting people's beliefs about their own next wage offer. This updating about people's next wage offer, it also persists if we re-interview people a week later and again ask them about the wage expectations without reminding them of the intervention. So this is a persistent change in their beliefs. And what we now do is we now want to use this exogenous variation in people's wage beliefs to get at the causal effect of these wage expectations on job search outcomes. So on this slide, I show you treatment effects on job search outcomes. And let me tell you, so for now, I focus on the 2 extreme groups. So with large prior pessimism or large prior optimism, because I have the largest first stage variation for these groups. So here, the outcome is people's reservation wage, so the lowest wage for which they would be willing to start a new job. And we find that receiving a large negative shock reduces reservation wages by 1.6%, as reported in our survey. A large positive shock increases reservation wages by about 4%. So this is in line with the model predictions. People change their reservation wages in line with their beliefs about their next wage offer. Now, if we look at search intensity as measured by the number of clicks on job ads on this search platform, so this is not reported in our survey, this is non-self-reported data. There we see that large negative shocks actually increase search effort. So people seem to, they want to compensate this negative shock to their wage potential by searching more, by increasing the, pool of available offers. There doesn't seem to be any effect on search intensity among those with receiving positive shocks. What we also see is that people who receive positive shocks, they not only increase their reservation wages, they also reduce their willingness to make concessions in terms of the location of their next wage offer. So they report in our survey that they become less willing to commute in order to find re-employment. They become less willing to relocate to find re-employment. And this is actually reflected if we look at registered job applications on the search platform. So we see a significant reduction in the search radius, the actual search radius in response to our information. So people not only become more selective in terms of the wages they target, but also the geographic characteristics of the next job. Okay, so how do these changes in search effort translate into job search outcomes? So what we do next is we look at treatment effects on the average monthly employment rate over 3 months or over 6 months after our treatment, as measured in the administrative, register data from the Danish population registers. So starting with negative shocks, we find that the treatment actually leads to a quite strong increase in re-employment rates of 3.7 percentage points or 3.9 percentage points over 3 or 6 months. So this is a relative to control group mean. So this is an effect size of more than 10%. So this is a quite strong increase in re-employment rates. this makes sense because this is the group,
What,
those who
one
receive,
minute left.
yes, large negative shocks. So these are groups who actually they reduce their reservation wages and increase their search effort. Surprisingly, we also see improved reemployment rates among those with positive shocks, who actually increase their reservation wages and search more locally. I'll skip this here, just talk a bit about mechanisms. I'll focus on those receiving positive shocks. So how can focusing on more local jobs enhance labor market outcomes? One explanation for this is spatial search frictions. And the idea here is that job seekers become less effective at generating acceptable offers as the distance of potential vacancies to the place of residence increases. And the idea is that people know the labor market less well. They might realize that they are actually unwilling to commute, so they might not accept offers that they get, and so on. And we have several pieces of evidence in our data that suggests, that support this interpretation that this improved reemployment rates among those with positive shocks actually is due to spatial search frictions. So, for instance, employment effects are concentrated in local jobs. The employment effects are concentrated among individuals who, before our survey, actually searched distantly and now search locally. And we also have a back end of the envelope calculation suggesting that spatial search frictions can actually account for the size of the employment increase that we see for these positively shocked people. And this then, suggests to, that so this seems to outweigh the increase in the reservation wage that we see for that group. So that brings me to the end. So with our paper, we look at how job seekers' wage expectations causally affect the search behavior and labor market outcomes using a survey that we linked with administrative click level data on search behavior and register data on employment outcomes. And our results have some implications for modeling job search and also we think some implications for policies. And yeah, looking forward to to getting your feedback. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the presentations. And again, for the audience, if you have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A. Okay, starting with a question for Marty, do you have a sense to what extent results might be affected when pricing frictions are endogenized, such as menu cost models? Perhaps in second generation menu cost models that are somewhat Cavo-like, this isn't as much of an issue.
Well, I think anything in the model that reduces swings in relative prices is going to make the problem less severe. And so then the question becomes, is this a menu cost model that's multi-sector or not? And so, but my general prior would be if inflation hits some upper band, as inflation gets bigger, menu costs kick in, and then the relative prices are smaller. The relative price movements are smaller. So I would expect, the more sensitive, the less prices are fixed, the less of a problem that we have, and menu costs basically do that.
Okay. Now we have a question for Johannes. You find that wage information can raise reservation wages for pessimistic workers without reducing employment. Thinking about the implications, does this suggest that standard labor market policies that might lower reservation wages should be complemented by focusing on beliefs as a friction?
So that's a very good question. So we feel that when it comes to policy implications, so one thing to keep in mind is that what we identify here in our experiment is like the effect of treating some individuals with this information, and then we can actually trace their the effects on labor market outcomes. If we think about rolling this out like as a general policy and an information campaign by the labor market authorities, then one has to think about GE effects, which is something that we do not capture in our experiment. Now, that said, we think that our experiment suggests that beliefs can have a powerful role and that there seem to be misperceptions which actually causally affect people's behavior. And so in that sense, labor market authorities should actually account for subjective beliefs in the labor market policies.
Okay. The next question is for Marty. It seems like your finding has strong implications for multi-sector models. I assume that your results would imply a bound for each sector, which could be particularly problematic if inflation rates in individual sectors are highly variable. Is this correct?
I think that's right. Although I haven't formally investigated the answer to your question, but it seems incredibly sensible. And as we go to network models and industry-specific shocks like oil, et cetera, these questions become really a great research topic. My prior is that the answer to your question is yes. And yeah, so I would just say yes. And I think we need to look at that question in network models or multi-sector models and see what happens.
Okay. Um, the next question is for Johannes. Um, and I guess this is for me. How do you think about unobservable idiosyncratic worker quality that you don't observe in the survey, but that the workers might be aware of when they're making their decisions?
Yeah. So that's so we think about um, what we had in mind was that wages, they consist of some, systematic component that varies with worker characteristics systematically. And this is what we capture in our belief measurement, and this is also what we shift people's beliefs about. At the same time, there will be an important idiosyncratic component that the wage has private information, that the worker has private information about that we don't observe. So our experiment is based on the idea that we shift beliefs about that systematic component, how people's, characteristics basically, systematically vary, systematically shift basically their wages. Now, in our experiment, if we look at updating of people's own wage expectations in response to this projection, we see learning rates of about 15% or so. So people, so this is so this means that people do not fully update towards the signal, which is consistent with the idea that there's lots of idiosyncratic private information going on that workers understand that they know and that this is not a perfect prediction basically for their own situation. Yeah.
Okay. Next, we have a question for Marty. Based on your analysis and also considering the large magnitudes you find for times of large shocks, what practical recommendations do you see for the measurement process of inflation, a process that may get redesigned soon as there is more and more data on prices available, both in breadth and frequency, and as we look for alternative data sources? And what might be your most important takeaway for central banks?
Well, that's a great question. I'm going to focus on the practical because it's easy to say, do a true price index. That's not very practical. So I would say that if you're a central bank and you think that there was a sector shock, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, which you can see, the obvious thing to do is to ask, well, did quantities change a lot, right? Because that's in principle something that you can see. And to the extent that that is true, the substitution bias is going to be particularly large. And therefore, you want to take the official inflation statistics with a larger grain of salt and maybe think, oh, that inflation rate sounds horrible, but it's not quite as horrible um, as you would think if you didn't worry about the substitution bias. So I think carefully asking, what was the shock? Was it sector specific, spilling over into other sectors, and then following what happens in the affected sector?
Mhm. Okay. And then I think the last question that we have time for today is for Johannes. How should we think about nonlinearities in your findings and what might be behind the underlying distortions?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we find different effects of basically upward shifts in wage expectations compared to downward shifts. And there might be two broad sets of reasons for that. So one explanation is that upward shifts and downward shifts have, systematically different effects, inherently different effects due to things like, for instance, loss aversion, which has been argued to be important in job search behavior. So that's one explanation. There's also another explanation, which is tied to our experimental design. So in our experimental design, so the prior beliefs, whether someone is a prior optimist or prior pessimist, is not randomly assigned. So these are people, this varies with people's characteristics. These are different groups of people. So it might also be that different groups of people just respond differently to a given change in their beliefs. And our design is not suited to actually tease these two apart. So we do a little bit in the paper, but to actually tease these two apart, you would need alternative designs where you actually have where you provide different signals to people with the same characteristics, which is something that we couldn't do in our setting for ethical reasons because we wouldn't be allowed to do it, and we were actually encouraged to provide the most accurate projection that we could provide. That said, I mean, there's so spatial search frictions. If people search this, I mean, you can only I mean, some margins of adjustment actually they naturally operate into one direction, but not in the other direction. But the extent to which this carries over, more generally to changes in wage expectations, probably one needs to look at alternative or additional designs and experiments.
Okay. Great. Well, I'd like to thank both presenters and the audience for attending today. This is the end of the session, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Thursday.
Great. Can I just say one thing about Johannes's paper? I think this is really, really a terrific paper, and
Thank
it
you.
cuts to a core issue of skepticism about survey results. I'm doing survey-based experiments. What's very, very special in your paper is you can see this correspondence between survey things that people say and what they actually do. That's a big deal. And so when you write it up, or say, maybe it's a separate paper, but that seems to me very, very important.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Methodologically.
Yeah. So this was like one of the motivations for us to do this in this setting, because we were able to link the survey with administrative data that we could follow people over time with. So we were hoping to actually achieve something like that. And yeah, we also view it as encouraging that you actually see this, even if you don't ask people in the same survey, but you see it actually if you follow them over time in administrative records. So
I
yeah,
will cite this paper on exactly that point.
thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. I think lots of cool stuff. So thank you, and happy holidays, safe travel, and
Happy
thank you,
holidays.
everybody.
Thank you. Happy
Take
holidays.
care.